Hello. Welcome to a new series I'm creating. It isn't my idea, but basically it's what if civilization started over, or WIXO for short. And basically it's just the idea is that you have a bunch of countries that start out from nothing and kind of pop into existence. You'll get the hang of it very quickly. Every WIXO series has a different story for how it starts. But in mine, what's going to happen is that through some weird magic, um, some humans from the modern day are going to get transported back in time to 300,000 years ago when the first anatomically modern humans began to exist. And they're basically going to teach them all the secrets of civilization. And we're going to show civilization as white. Um, and also through magic, all other hominid species that aren't humans are going to die out, so we don't have to worry about that. As well as the continents are going to take their modern shape. This is some weird magic. And the 10 or so humans who came back to teach civilization weren't able to teach like how to get all the way to modern civilization, so they only get to Stone Age. And then the 10 modern humans are going to die after about a year, and so now it's just a bunch of old humans. And they're going to be where humanity started, and they're going to kind of have to do everything on their own. One of my ideas is that with this system, it makes a lot more sense why there's no tribal period, because the tribal period is basically just being skipped. And so instead, we are going to skip right to this period. So the white is going to be areas that humans have explored and maybe settled, whereas the red is the areas that are controlled by the First Empire. And a mechanic that pretty much every series has is a layer that has cities on it. So we're obviously going to do that in this series. And then there's also usually a layer that has capitals on it. So we're also going to have that. Obviously, there's not very many humans right now, like maybe 1,000 in the world total. So the threshold for what counts as a big city is going to increase. Right now, there's actually no cities that would qualify, but I still want to show the capital. Capitals are automatically going to be considered big cities, even if they're technically not. So anyway, hundreds of generations are going to pass. Not much is going to happen. They discover the ocean. They realize it's a better source of food, is fishing, although they do have agriculture, right? But slowly but surely, they're going to spread out as the population slowly increases. As they spread out, they're not intentionally exploring any of this land, right? Because they don't. But eventually, a king of this country will decide that the population is still getting too much. And to show that, we'll show the minimum threshold to be a major city is now, let's say, about 2,000 people. And a few more cities have popped up along the coast, as well as one inland, that have that threshold. And the population, this guy thinks is too dense. It's not. It really isn't. Like, compared to our cities, this is like Alaska levels of density. But he thinks it's too densely populated. And so he basically creates a plan to start exploring some more land. So he tells people, let's explore down the Somali coast. And to get between these areas faster, eventually they start. And so this area gets discovered. He also says, let's explore up the Eritrean coast. And obviously they do that. And this red country is going to be called Ethiopia for obvious reasons. But anyways, there's going to be a new settlement of people over here. But there's not really any people over here because they were just exploring. But anyway, a new settlement of people is going to go over here. And they're trading with these guys. And enough people are convinced to move here that it's going to have 2 cities that meet the current threshold. But actually, the king who wanted to explore has died a little while ago now. And so now it's his son, and then it's his grandson, and they still have the idea, but then his great-grandson, it's long enough ago that he doesn't really like that idea anymore. He wants to focus on what they have, and so they kind of stop the exploring, but they've actually explored a lot. But also, these people have been separate from these guys for a while, and they don't really like being under the rule of the king. So they're going to attempt to rebel, and to stop them, the king is going to obviously have to start settling some people next to them. This king has like an actual army, whereas these guys don't. They just kind of said, hey, we're not listening to you anymore. We have our own ruler. And so they don't have an army, and so they're pretty quickly crushed. But now it's the king, and he's the great-great-grandson of the king you wanted to explore. And this king decides we need to start filling in some of this territory so we can have better control over all of our stuff. Like, look at all this territory we've explored where no one's living. Let's change that. And he kind of doesn't want exploration. And he starts making some cities that are kind of acting a little bit as military posts. And this is basically just a way to ensure that the population doesn't want to rebel. But something interesting is going to happen. Okay, so the king who set up all these cities, he has no heirs. And really, this has never happened before. And so there's no succession plan. Like, usually it would go to, like, his cousin or something. But no, there's no succession plan set up. And so it's not really sure who should take the throne. One of his cousins does claim that he should have the throne. But these two cities over here kind of want to be independent, as well as like a group of cities over here. And so they're going to declare independence again from Ethiopia and create their new country of Somalia. Meanwhile, a bunch of military guys who got posted along the Eritrean coast are going to be able to seize power before the cousin king. Okay, so these military leaders also declare independence from Ethiopia and are able to do so. And this cousin king, he basically just lost half of his military to Eritrea. So he basically makes a truce with these guys and says, hey, why don't we give you independence on the condition that you help us fight the Somali rebellion? And obviously they're like, yeah. And the Somali rebellion doesn't really have that much of a military. And so at first, these guys are easily able to take land, but they don't really know military strategy, so they're just kind of pushing the entire front forward at once instead of trying to like split them or anything. Meanwhile, the Somali rebellion has a lot of power, or has a lot of motivation because they've already been crushed once. They don't want to get crushed again, and they think they'll be punished. They probably will if they get crushed. So they kind of muster a bunch of force and are able to fight back. And of course, you thought that Eritrea would actually listen to Ethiopia. No, the military leaders of Eritrea basically stab Ethiopia in the back and start their own invasion. And they were stationed here, meanwhile invading over here. And with this, the Ethiopian leaders, a lot of them get called back out of the Somali rebellion, and the Somali rebellion starts chasing them back and basically demanding independence. Meanwhile, these guys are actually still successful because they're pretty militaristic. But these guys, will deal with these guys later. The military is for now chasing Ethiopia, and the cousin king is very nervous. So he signs a peace with Somalia, because then he thinks that Somalia is going to start attacking these guys, which they do. So this guy has to pull all of his troops out of Somalia, which he does because he wants to focus on Ethiopia. But as he's doing so, Somalia and Ethiopia manage to blockade his ships and sink his entire navy that was here. And that allows Ethiopia to start pushing against Eritrea. But eventually he gets stuck, and Eritrea is able to start pushing again. And eventually these two sides, once the cousin king dies and his son takes over, they've been fighting for like 25 years at this point, and they kind of just are tired of it, and this son immediately gives this land to Eritrea, which means we can have some more capitals. The capital of Eritrea will be here, and the capital of Somalia will be here. And all three of these countries have different priorities. So Somalia is a monarchy, but it's pretty focused on its people for obvious reasons. So they will expand a little bit into here because their people want to expand a little bit, but beyond that, they're kind of going to stay put. Ethiopia is basically stuck with the idea of vengeance, and so they are going to try an idea of aggressive expansion. This is the son of the king who signed peace with Eritrea is in power now, and he wants just basically to enact vengeance on both of the people who seceded from his kingdom. He was only like 10 when the peace was signed, but he was very patriotic, I guess. So he's sending explorers out a lot. These are Eritrean explorers probably, but basically after a while he gets Ethiopia to colonize all of the land up to here, to colonize all of the land up to here. And he starts basically doing a cities program like one of his ancestors did. And he starts setting up some cities over here. And by now the threshold for being considered a major city is 10,000 people. Eritrea is a military dictatorship. It's also a monarchy in that it's hereditary, but it's very militarized, so it's a militarized monarchy. And they are exploring up Egypt, and they're kind of realizing that, hey, this land is kind of fertile. And eventually, they don't really care about setting up cities because they don't really care about their population. But they do end up setting up one here by accident. But eventually, they send an expedition westward to see why this land is so fertile, and they manage to discover the Nile. So they're going to discover this. They managed to discover this much land, but that includes the Nile. And so they realize, hey, the Nile is why all of this land is so fertile. But these people who were sent out here to explore, they don't really like living under the military regime of Eritrea. And again, it's a monarchy, but it's a militarized monarchy. They don't like that. So the leader of this expedition declares himself to be a new king, and they set up the kingdom of Egypt right over here. And Eritrea is wondering why their band of people hasn't come back, but they don't really care because they're kind of not very good at governing. They're kind of just good at having a military. But they do also end up sending some explorers up here, and they discover Arabia, but they don't actually end up sending any people up there. Some people will move there for fun. But when Somalia hears about this land, some of their citizens want to go, and the monarch encourages them to, and they end up just incidentally exploring some more land. And so their borders look like this, and that's really interesting because the government up here is kind of upset about this, as some cities start to pop up in this territory. And the Eritrean government is really upset because they think they deserve this territory. So they decide to set up a city here. That's mostly just going to... They decide to set up a city over here. That's mostly going to serve as like a base from which they can launch attacks. And they don't officially declare war on Somalia. I think it's too early in history for that to happen. They do start raids into Somali territory, taking this land and kind of just occupying it. So for now, the land is just going to remain occupied. But slowly but surely, they take all of this land from Somalia. And Somalia knows it's happening, but doesn't really do anything about it. And their citizens kind of get upset about that, but what are they going to do? So Eritrea has just gotten a bunch of land. While all that was happening, Ethiopia was still slowly but surely trying to expand, trying to get more powerful, because they see Eritrea as gaining power. So they are still doing what they were doing a while ago, which is just to try and get bigger, because they think that if they have more territory, that'll mean they have more people, and that'll mean they can defeat Eritrea, who's their main rival. Like, they're upset about the loss of Somalia, but Somalia did kind of team up with them to fight against Eritrea, so they're not that bitter about Somalia. They're much more bitter about Eritrea. But anyway, Ethiopia knows that population is what matters, so they set up more cities. They're by far the most populated, but that might not be true for long, because Egypt is so fertile that their population has been rapidly expanding, so that now their population encompasses all of this land, and then therefore, in doing so, they've incidentally explored a bunch of land as well, obviously. And a ridiculous number of cities are going to pop up over here. Let's say the threshold is 15,000 for a major city now, so it's slightly increased. But anyway, Eritrea is just exploring this way, and they discover Egypt. And they're like, hey, weren't you founded by our explorers from like 125 years ago? And they're like, actually, it's probably longer than that, probably like 200 years ago. But these guys, it was kind of like a myth/mystery, like, where did those explorers go? Ooh. And so they realize this is the explorers, and they're like, ooh, we can conquer this territory. And heavily militarized Ethiopia versus Egypt, which has a lot of population, in fact, more than Ethiopia, which is kind of sad, but not very militarized, and their capital is almost immediately under siege. Eritrea, has good military strategy. They managed to besiege the capital. The capital is not budging, but eventually it's almost about to fall. But Ethiopia sees this as their chance, and they pounce on Eritrea while their entire military is distracted because Eritrea hasn't heard the idea of a two-front war yet. And two of their, so these three cities as well as these three cities, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, those 6 cities are their population centers, and not really this one actually, so it's kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are their population centers, whereas 1, 2, 3, 4 of their cities are kind of just military bases that happen to have a lot of people in them. And so a good portion, like I'd say 30% of Eritrea's population has been captured, which is bad because they have a lot less people to recruit from. And the news hasn't even reached these guys in Egypt yet, as they finally reached the city walls, but are still besieging the city. However, Eritrea is able to keep the news from these guys who would be itching to rebel otherwise, but Somalia finds out and sends news to these guys, hey, you guys should rebel. And the areas that were once held by Somalia do rebel, and Somalia is kind of upset. They thought that these lands would become Somali, but no, these lands want to be their own country. They have a different enough culture from Somalia, and they put their capital here. And now Eritrea is fighting a three-front war if they don't give these guys independence, and of course they don't because they don't realize that they shouldn't be fighting a three-front war. And they start sending some troops into these guys, but they manage to hold off with maybe some help from Somalia, so it's now everyone versus Eritrea. And at this point, Eritrea is forced to withdraw some of their forces from Egypt, as a lot of Egyptian people kind of start revolting against Eritrea, and they lose this entire chunk of land. And with this, Egypt is able to kind of force Eritrea almost out of their country entirely, only to this land. But Eritrea is able to start quelling this rebellion with only this city left, and Somalia is now fully aiding this city. However, Ethiopia has still been making slow and steady progress, and they're outside the gates of the capital, while also starting to push up towards this major city, which is a military base, so it would still be valuable as a target. Egypt has finally pushed Eritrea out, and at this point, Eritrea decides to fall back to here, which could be a good move, but could also be a bad move because now they've lost a lot of their land, and they decide to completely abandon this front, and then they didn't expect to be invaded here, but they were. But that allows them to start fighting back against Ethiopia, and they sign a peace deal with Egypt, giving them control of a lot of the territory, but they do require this military base to remain under the Eritrean control. And now Eritrea gives independence to these guys so they can withdraw their troops from there. And Eritrea is now winning against Ethiopia because they've withdrawn from all of their fronts besides Ethiopia. But Ethiopia is not going to go down that easily. They have a lot more population, and they start drafting their population, turning this into almost a total war for Ethiopia. And they start pushing back against Eritrea. But then Somalia comes in, and they basically tell Ethiopia, hey, we don't want you to beat Eritrea because then not only are we going to be your next target, but also you're going to be way stronger than we want you to be. So we're going to join the war on the side of Eritrea unless you decide to accept a compromise peace deal with Eritrea, and Eritrea is obviously all in on that, and Ethiopia is forced to accept it as well. And so this is what the compromise peace deal looks like. And with that, I'm going to end episode 1 of What If Civilization Started Over. So this is what the map looks like so far. I will say the new Yemen country does do a little bit of exploration. But yeah, with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in episode 2. Bye.